In 1968, one company controlled almost every car brand in Britain: Austin, Morris, MG, Rover, Jaguar, Triumph. Nearly every badge on every British road belonged to a single business. 15 years later, that company was a national joke. Its cars were mocked, its factories were shutting down, and it had cost British taxpayers over £3 billion trying to keep it alive. This is the story of how British Leyland was built, and how it destroyed the very industry it was created to save. Today, not a single major car brand is British-owned. Jaguar and Land Rover belong to an Indian company. Mini belongs to Germany. Bentley and Rolls-Royce belong to Germany too. Aston Martin has passed through half a dozen owners. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to one deal. A deal that, on paper, was supposed to save British car manufacturing forever. By the mid-1960s, Britain's car industry was already fractured into two camps. On one side was the British Motor Corporation, later British Motor Holdings, which owned Austin, Morris, MG, Wolseley and Riley. On the other was Leyland Motors, a company that had built its name on trucks and buses, but had spent the 1960s quietly buying up Britain's most prestigious car brands: Standard Triumph in 1960 and Rover not long after. Jaguar had joined the BMC side of the table in 1966, bringing Daimler with it. Leyland's chairman, Sir Donald Stokes, had a vision. He wanted to build Britain's answer to General Motors. One company controlling everything from budget family cars to luxury saloons to commercial trucks, able to compete head-on with the American giants. On paper, it looked unstoppable. The British government agreed. The merger was actively encouraged by the Labour government's Industrial Reorganisation Corporation, which believed a single national champion was the only way to keep the British car industry alive against Japanese and American competition. On the 17th of January, 1968, British Motor Holdings and Leyland Motor Corporation merged to form British Leyland Motor Corporation. Stokes and his team now controlled Austin, Morris, MG, Wolseley, Riley, Triumph, Rover, Jaguar, Daimler and Alvis, alongside trucks, buses and even industrial refrigerators. It should have been the beginning of a golden age for British cars. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. And the reason has almost nothing to do with the cars themselves. Here's the problem nobody accounted for. British Leyland wasn't really one company. It was 10 rival companies forced to share a building. Austin, Morris and Triumph had spent decades as direct competitors. Different engineering philosophies, different factories, different customer bases, and, crucially, different unions with different agreements. Instead of consolidating everything into a smaller number of well-run factories, British Leyland tried to keep every brand alive, every factory open, every product line running. The result was duplication on a staggering scale, multiple teams effectively designing competing cars for the exact same customer inside the same company. Then came the labour disputes. Between 1971 and 1975 alone, British Leyland lost more working days to strikes than any other company in Britain, over 13.5 million man-days. In 1978, one union convener at the Longbridge plant, Derek Robinson, nicknamed Red Robbo, was linked to 523 separate walkouts in a single year. Chairman Michael Edwards later estimated Robinson's disputes alone had cost the company £200 million in lost production. One strike, in 1975, started over a dispute about beards. It idled 40,000 workers and cost the company the equivalent of $100 million in lost output over a workplace grooming policy. The strikes were only half the problem. The other half showed up the moment a British Leyland car actually reached a customer. Quality control was inconsistent from factory to factory, sometimes from shift to shift. Panel gaps, electrical faults. Paint that didn't match. Owners quickly learned to check their new car over carefully before driving it off the forecourt, a habit that became a grim British motoring tradition. By 1980, British Leyland's share of the UK car market, the same market it had controlled 40% of just over a decade earlier, had fallen to 18.2%. By 1975, British Leyland was, in effect, bankrupt, facing the collapse of Britain's largest car manufacturer, and the loss of well over 100,000 jobs. The government commissioned an emergency review led by industrialist Sir Don Ryder. The Ryder Report, published in April 1975, recommended the state step in and take a controlling stake rather than let the company fail outright. The government agreed. British Leyland was effectively nationalised, placed under a new holding company with the taxpayer as its principal shareholder. It was, in the words of one minister, considered too big to fail. Nationalisation kept the lights on. It did not fix a single one of the underlying problems. In 1977, the government brought in a new chairman, Michael Edwards, a tough, outsider executive with a mandate to do what nobody before him had been willing to do. He closed underperforming factories. He cut tens of thousands of jobs. He took on the unions directly, forcing through changes that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. Edwards even negotiated an unlikely partnership. In 1981, British Leyland began building Japanese-designed Honda models under license, badged as the Triumph Acclaim. A British company building someone else's car, inside its own factories, because it no longer trusted its own engineering pipeline to deliver a reliable product on time. By the early 1980s, the total taxpayer subsidy to keep British Leyland alive had passed £3 billion. From here, the story becomes one long, slow unwind. In 1984, Jaguar was floated off as an independent company again, free of the British Leyland name. Within 5 years, Ford had bought it outright. In 1986, what remained of British Leyland was renamed the Rover Group in an attempt to shed the toxic reputation the old name now carried. Rover became a subsidiary of British Aerospace in 1988, then was sold to BMW in 1994. BMW's ownership didn't go well either. In 2000, the German company split Rover apart and sold it off in pieces. Land Rover went to Ford, and the remaining Rover and MG brands were sold for a symbolic sum to a British consortium hoping to save what was left. It didn't work. In 2005, MG Rover, the final surviving fragment of the company once known as British Leyland, collapsed into administration. It was the end of mass car production by a British-owned manufacturer, full stop. The MG, Austin, Morris and Wolseley names were bought by China's SAIC. Almost 40 years after Donald Stokes stood in front of reporters and announced Britain's new national car champion, there was nothing British-owned left to champion. So what actually survived? Jaguar and Land Rover still exist, now owned by India's Tata Motors and still built in the UK. Mini still exists, owned by BMW, still built at the old Cowley plant in Oxford. Leyland Trucks, the commercial vehicle arm that started it all, still builds trucks in Lancashire. Unipart, once British Leyland's parts division, is still trading today. And SAIC, the Chinese company that bought MG's remaining assets, actually operates its UK engineering base out of the old Longbridge site, the same factory where Red Robbo led hundreds of walkouts in the 1970s. British Leyland wasn't destroyed by bad cars alone, or bad management alone, or bad labour relations alone. It was destroyed by all three, feeding each other for over a decade, while the rest of the world's car industry moved on without it. What's left is a strange kind of legacy. Some of the most beloved car names in the world still on the road today, just owned by almost anyone except Britain. If you didn't know most of that story, you're exactly who this channel is for. Every day, we're covering a different piece of British car history. The legends, the failures, and the scandals nobody talks about anymore. Subscribe if you want the next one. And let me know in the comments, which British car company should we cover next?